Welcome to Whispering Epochs, where the past whispers you to sleep. Here you'll hear fascinating bedtime stories. Listen until the end to uncover the hidden events of history.
In the dim glow of a flickering candle, imagine yourself waking up in a modest wooden hut somewhere in the countryside of medieval Europe. The year is perhaps 1347, though you have no calendar and no real way of marking the exact day. You are a peasant, as most people were, and your life is bound not by personal ambition, but by the slow, repetitive rhythm of the seasons. There is no morning alarm clock, no hot coffee machine, no hot shower. Instead, you awaken to the sound of roosters, the damp smell of straw, and the faint chill of air slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls. Your bed is nothing more than a pile of hay, covered with a coarse wool blanket. The hay scratches your skin, and sometimes tiny insects wander over your legs during the night. The blanket is heavy, but not particularly warm, especially in the depths of winter. If you are lucky, there might be a small fire still smoldering in the hearth, but firewood is scarce, and keeping it burning all night is a luxury you cannot afford. The air is damp, and every breath you take carries the faint scent of smoke and earth. There is no rush to get ready, because your routine never truly changes. You dress in the same simple tunic and rough trousers you wore yesterday and the day before, and likely every day for months. The fabric is made from coarse wool or linen, dyed in muted browns or grays, because vibrant colors are reserved for those with wealth and status. Your shoes, if you have them at all, are little more than leather wrappings tied around your feet. Breakfast, such as it is, might consist of a piece of coarse, dark bread made from rye, accompanied by a small amount of cheese if it is available. The bread is dense, heavy, and sometimes stale, but it is filling enough to keep you working for hours. Clean drinking water is not always easy to find, so weak ale or watered-down beer is the standard drink even in the morning. It is not consumed for pleasure, but for necessity. The brewing process makes it safer than untreated water from a nearby stream. The day ahead is simple in purpose, but exhausting in execution. If you work the fields, you will spend hours tilling the soil, planting seeds, or harvesting crops, depending on the season. Your tools are basic: wooden-handled hoes, scythes, and sickles. There are no machines to lighten the load. Every task requires your own hands, your own strength, and your own endurance. The land is not yours, of course. It belongs to the local lord, whose manor looms somewhere in the distance. You are allowed to farm it only in exchange for labor, goods, and loyalty. The social structure is rigid and unchanging. At the top, there is the king or queen, far away and almost mythical in your imagination. Beneath them, the nobility and knights control vast estates. Below them, the clergy hold spiritual and often political power. At the bottom, there is you, the peasant, bound to the land, expected to work without question and with little hope of changing your position in life. You cannot imagine moving up in the world. The idea simply does not exist in your time. Hygiene, as you know it today, is virtually non-existent. Baths are rare, taken only a few times a year, often in communal settings. Soap is harsh and expensive, usually reserved for laundry rather than skin. Clothes are washed infrequently, and the smell of unwashed bodies is a constant in daily life. Toothbrushes do not exist. People clean their teeth, if at all, with twigs or cloth. As the day wears on, the work continues with little variation. The sun moves across the sky, and your life follows its path. There are no clocks to mark the hours, only the slow progression of light and shadow. Your meals are small and repetitive. Bread, porridge, sometimes beans or cabbage, and, on rare occasions, a bit of salted meat. Every bite is hard-earned, and nothing is wasted. The evening brings no respite in the modern sense. There is no entertainment beyond the occasional village gathering, the telling of stories, or the sound of a traveling musician if one happens to pass through. Light comes only from the fire or from candles made of tallow, which give off a smoky, greasy scent. You might sit quietly mending clothes or repairing tools before returning to your bed of hay. Sleep is not deep, as the night is filled with the sounds of wind, animals, and sometimes the uneasy howls of wolves in the distance. And so the days pass, slowly, steadily, and without much change. In this world, survival is a matter of repetition, and the harshness of life is softened only by the rare moments of laughter, the warmth of shared bread, or the comfort of familiar faces. The changing of seasons in medieval times was not merely a matter of weather, but a shift in the entire structure of daily life. In the spring, the fields had to be plowed and seeded as soon as the ground thawed. This was often done using oxen, or, if the village was poor, simply with the strength of human hands pulling crude plows. Planting had to be precise and swift, for any delay could lead to hunger months later. The work was exhausting, bending low over the earth, pushing seeds into the soil, and covering them with clumps of damp dirt. Summer brought longer days, but not rest. Weeding, tending to crops, repairing fences, and caring for animals consumed every waking hour. Cows needed milking, sheep needed shearing, and chickens provided precious eggs. Tools dulled quickly and required constant maintenance. Iron was expensive, so broken tools were mended repeatedly rather than replaced. Every item had value. Nothing was wasted. In the heat of summer, there was no escape from the sun. Clothing, though made of wool or linen, was thick and heavy, trapping warmth. Drinking water was often fetched from wells or rivers, and it was not always clean. Illness could spread quickly, and without modern medicine, even something as simple as a fever or infected cut could become life-threatening. Autumn was the season of harvest. Entire villages worked together, cutting grain with sickles, binding it into sheaths, and carrying it to be threshed. The harvest determined the survival of the community through winter. A poor harvest meant hunger, or worse, famine. Once the grain was stored, the process of preserving food began. Salting meat, drying beans, storing root vegetables in cellars. Firewood was gathered in great quantities as the cold months loomed. Winter was the harshest time. Work in the fields ceased, but life became no easier. The cold seeped into every corner of the home, frost forming on the inside of windows, if there were windows at all. Food was rationed carefully. Meals became smaller and less frequent as the months dragged on. The only light came from the hearth or from tallow candles, casting long shadows on the walls. People often huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and sleeping close to animals for the extra heat their bodies provided. Life expectancy was short. Disease, injury, or a bad year for crops could end a life quickly. Children were particularly vulnerable, and many did not survive past infancy. Those who reached adulthood bore the marks of hard labor, bent backs, calloused hands, and worn faces long before their time. Yet, despite the hardships, there were moments of joy. Festivals marked the passing of the seasons with music, dancing, and feasting when food was plentiful. Religious holidays brought the community together, offering a reprieve from the relentless toil. Stories were told by the fire, songs were sung, and bonds between neighbors and families were strengthened. These small joys, fleeting though they were, provided the strength to endure another day, another season, another year. The church played a central role in medieval life. It was not only a place of worship, but also a source of news, education, and charity. The local priest was often one of the few literate people in the village, reading aloud from the scriptures and offering guidance. Religious belief was woven into every aspect of existence, from planting to harvest, from birth to death. Superstitions were common, and many believed that illness, misfortune, or bad weather were signs of divine displeasure. Travel was rare for most peasants. The farthest many ever went was to the nearest market town, perhaps a few miles away. Roads were muddy in the wet months and dusty in the dry, and travel could be dangerous due to bandits or wild animals. News from the outside world was slow to arrive, and often carried by traveling merchants or pilgrims. As the year turned and winter's grip loosened, the cycle began again. Life in the medieval world was an endless repetition of work, survival, and the small cherished moments in between. There was no concept of retirement, no expectation of an easy life. The rhythm of existence was steady, unchanging, and dictated entirely by the forces of nature. In the medieval world, most people's lives were tied to the land, but a small number lived in towns and cities. These places, though often small by modern standards, were bustling hubs of trade, craft, and opportunity. Streets were narrow, winding, and usually unpaved, turning into streams of mud after rain. Buildings leaned toward each other at strange angles, their upper stories jutting out over the lower ones. The air was filled with the sounds of merchants shouting their wares, the clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestones, and the occasional ringing of a church bell. Markets were the lifeblood of these towns. Farmers brought produce, craftsmen sold goods, and traders offered exotic items from far-away lands. Spices, silks, and fine tools were rare and expensive, coveted by the wealthy. Ordinary people came to sell simple goods, baskets, pottery, wooden tools, and homespun cloth. The smell in the market was a mixture of fresh bread, roasting meat, animals, and less pleasant odors from waste and refuse. Craftsmen and guilds played an important role in urban life. A skilled blacksmith, carpenter, or weaver could make a decent living, though work was still hard and hours were long. Guilds controlled the quality of goods, the prices, and the training of apprentices. Becoming a master in your trade could take years of dedication, starting from a boy's apprenticeship and working under the guidance of an experienced craftsman. Water was drawn from public wells, and waste was often thrown into the street, leading to foul smells and outbreaks of disease. The concept of sanitation, as understood today, was absent. People sometimes carried small bouquets or herbs to mask unpleasant odors when walking through crowded areas. Rats and other pests thrived in these conditions, spreading illnesses that could devastate a population. Despite the hardships, towns were centers of culture and change. Traveling performers, musicians, and storytellers brought news and entertainment. Religious processions and fairs offered opportunities for both devotion and festivity. Minstrels sang songs of love and battle, while jugglers and actors drew crowds in open squares. People gathered in taverns not only to drink but to share stories, exchange information, and conduct business. Education was limited and often tied to the church. Monasteries preserved manuscripts and knowledge, while cathedral schools trained future clerics and scholars. Only a small fraction of the population could read and write, and literacy was a valuable skill. Books were rare and precious, copied by hand on parchment, making them expensive and slow to produce. The legal system in medieval towns was a mix of local customs, royal decrees, and religious laws. Disputes were often settled in public hearings, and punishments could be harsh. Stocks, pillories, and public shaming were common, as was the use of fines or forced labor. In more serious cases, execution was a real possibility, carried out in front of crowds as both punishment and deterrent. As night fell, the streets grew dark and dangerous. There were no street lights, only the glow from windows or torches carried by watchmen. Most people avoided going out after dark unless necessary. Fires were a constant fear, as wooden houses stood close together, and a single spark could devastate entire neighborhoods. Because of this, towns often enforced curfews, and the watch patrolled to keep order. Life in medieval towns was faster paced than in the countryside, but it was not free of hardship. The dangers were different: disease, crime, and the risk of fire, yet the struggle to survive remained the same. People worked, traded, celebrated, and mourned in close proximity, their lives intertwined by the crowded streets and shared struggles. Beyond the towns and villages, the medieval world stretched into vast forests, rolling fields, and distant mountains. Travel through these landscapes was slow and unpredictable. Roads were little more than dirt paths, worn by the passage of carts, animals, and countless footsteps. In wet weather, they turned into deep mud. In dry spells, they became dusty and uneven. Bridges were rare, and travelers often had to ford rivers or find shallow crossings. Most people rarely traveled far from their homes. The journey to a nearby town could take hours or even days, depending on the terrain. Travelers often moved in groups for safety, as the roads could be dangerous. Bandits lurked in forests and remote areas, preying on merchants and pilgrims. Wolves and other wild animals posed their own threats, especially in winter when food was scarce. For those who did venture far, inns and roadside taverns offered food and shelter, though comfort was minimal. A traveler might sleep on a straw mattress in a crowded room, sharing space with strangers. Meals were plain: bread, stew, and ale. Cleanliness was not guaranteed, and bed bugs or fleas were common companions. Still, these inns were essential waypoints, providing rest and a place to exchange news from distant places. Pilgrimages were one of the most common reasons for long journeys. People traveled to visit holy sites, seeking blessings, cures, or spiritual renewal. Pilgrims wore distinctive badges or clothing to mark their purpose, and they often traveled along established routes that led to famous cathedrals or shrines. Such journeys could take months, and pilgrims relied on the hospitality of monasteries and charitable hosts along the way. Merchants, too, traveled great distances to sell goods in other regions. They brought salt, cloth, metalwork, and sometimes luxury items like spices or glassware. The trade routes connected towns and even countries, though the trip was always risky. Weather, illness, and theft could turn a profitable journey into disaster. Castles dotted the landscape, serving as strongholds for the nobility and as symbols of authority. Built from stone, they rose above the surrounding land, their high walls and towers visible from miles away. Inside, life was far from the comfort often imagined. Castles were cold, drafty, and dimly lit, with only a few rooms heated by fireplaces. Still, they were secure against most attacks, and they housed not only the lord's family, but also soldiers, servants, and craftsmen. Life for those within the castle was organized around defense and governance. Soldiers trained regularly, maintaining weapons and armor. Servants prepared food, repaired clothing, and kept the fires burning. In the great hall, the Lord held feasts, met with advisers, and heard disputes from those who lived on his lands. The surrounding countryside was often dotted with smaller manors, each controlling farmland and villages. These manors formed the backbone of the feudal system, with peasants working the land in exchange for protection and the right to live there. The system created a network of obligations that tied everyone to someone above them and often to someone below them. Beyond the manors and castles, there were vast stretches of wilderness. Forests provided timber, game, and foraging opportunities, but they were also places of mystery and danger. Many folk tales warned of spirits, witches, or creatures lurking among the trees. While much of this was superstition, it reflected the uncertainty of traveling far from the safety of one's home. The medieval world, though smaller in scope than today's globalized society, was still full of movement, exchange, and encounters between different peoples. Yet each journey was a challenge, and survival often depended on the goodwill of strangers, the blessing of good weather, and a great deal of luck. The medieval diet was simple, shaped by the seasons, local resources, and one's social class. For peasants, meals revolved around bread, pottage, and ale. Bread was often made from rye or barley, producing a dense, dark loaf. Wheat bread was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes a bit of meat, was a daily staple. It could be flavored with herbs when available, but spices were rare and expensive. Meat was not common for most people, except on special occasions or religious feasts. When available, it might include pork, mutton, or poultry. Hunting was usually restricted by law to the nobility, so wild game like deer or boar rarely reached a peasant's table. Fish, however, was more accessible, especially in areas near rivers or the coast. Many medieval diets included preserved fish, such as salted herring. The wealthy enjoyed a much broader range of foods. Their meals featured roast meats, fine white bread, fresh fruit, and exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. These spices, imported from distant lands, were costly and displayed the host's wealth and status. Feasts in noble households were elaborate affairs, with multiple courses served on ornate platters. Entertainment, such as music, storytelling, or even trained animals, often accompanied these meals. Religious fasting rules influenced eating habits across all classes. Many days of the year, especially during Lent, meat was forbidden, and fish or vegetarian dishes took its place. The church's influence extended deep into the kitchen, dictating not just what could be eaten, but when. Food preservation was essential for survival through the winter months. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were common methods. Root cellars kept vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions edible for months. Grains were stored in large bins, protected from pests as best as possible. The fear of running out of food before the next harvest was ever present, and households guarded their supplies carefully. Drinks were just as important as food. Water was often unsafe to drink, especially in towns. So ale, beer, and sometimes weak wine were consumed daily, even by children. The brewing process killed harmful bacteria, making these drinks safer. Stronger wines were reserved for wealthy or for special occasions. Meals were eaten at simple wooden tables for peasants, often shared with family and sometimes neighbors. Utensils were minimal: a wooden spoon, a knife, and perhaps a shared drinking vessel. Plates were often nothing more than wooden boards or trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as edible platters. In noble households, silverware, fine pottery, and glassware displayed wealth and refinement. The act of eating was both a necessity and a social ritual. In villages, meals brought families together after long days of work. In castles, feasts were political as well as social events, displaying the lord's power, generosity, and ability to host important guests. The food, the seating arrangement, and the entertainment all conveyed messages about status and alliances. But whether in a humble hut or a grand hall, the rhythm of eating was tied to the land and the seasons. Spring brought fresh greens and herbs after a long winter of stored food. Summer and autumn were times of plenty, with fruits, vegetables, and fresh meat more readily available. Winter meant careful rationing, creative cooking, and a reliance on whatever had been preserved months before. The medieval table reflected a world where survival depended on planning, hard work, and respect for the cycles of nature. Every bite was part of a larger story, one of community, tradition, and the endless balancing act between feast and famine. Religion shaped every aspect of medieval life, from birth to death. The church was the central institution, guiding morality, law, education, and even the calendar itself. Every village, no matter how small, had a church at its heart. Its bells marked the hours for prayer, called people to Mass, and signaled important events. For the average person, religious observance was woven into daily routines. The year was filled with holy days, feast days, and saints' days, each bringing its own rituals and traditions. Sunday Mass was obligatory, and attendance was a sign of faith and community membership. The priest served as both spiritual leader and advisor, often mediating disputes and offering counsel. Cathedrals and monasteries stood as symbols of devotion and architectural achievement. Cathedrals soared high above towns, their stained glass windows telling biblical stories in vivid color. Building such structures took decades, sometimes centuries, requiring the labor of countless craftsmen, stonemasons, and artisans. Monasteries, by contrast, were quieter places of prayer and study, where monks copied manuscripts, cultivated gardens, and offered hospitality to travelers. Religious art was everywhere. Painted icons, carved statues, illuminated manuscripts, all serving to educate and inspire. Since most people could not read, images and stained glass acted as visual sermons, teaching the faithful about the lives of saints, the stories of the Bible, and the rewards of heaven versus the punishments of hell. Pilgrimages were deeply spiritual journeys, often undertaken as acts of penance or devotion. Some traveled to local shrines, while others embarked on long treks to distant holy sites, like Santiago de Compostela or Rome. Pilgrims carried tokens and badges to show their journey's purpose, and upon returning, they often shared tales of their travels, bringing a glimpse of the wider world to their home communities. The church also held immense political power. Kings and nobles sought its blessing, and disputes between rulers were sometimes settled through religious mediation. Excommunication, being cut off from the sacraments, was a severe punishment that could isolate individuals or even entire regions from the Christian community. Monastic life was a path chosen by some to escape the world's hardships and devote themselves entirely to God. Monks and nuns followed strict rules, rising early for prayer, working in silence, and dedicating hours to study and copying texts. Their work preserved much of the ancient knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Religious festivals brought joy and community spirit. Christmas, Easter, and local saints' days were marked by processions, music, and special foods. These events broke the monotony of daily labor and reinforced the shared beliefs that bound the community together. Yet religion also carried a sense of fear. The threat of eternal damnation was real in the minds of medieval people, and misfortune was often seen as a sign of divine punishment. Superstitions blended with official church teachings, leading to practices aimed at warding off evil or pleasing the saints. In a world without modern science, the Church's explanations for natural events, from illness to storms, held great authority. Faith was not just a matter of the soul, it was the foundation upon which the medieval worldview rested. Life was short, unpredictable, and often harsh, but the promise of eternal salvation offered hope, purpose, and a guiding light through the darkness. Medicine in the medieval period was a mixture of ancient knowledge, superstition, and trial and error practice. The understanding of the human body was limited, based largely on the teachings of classical authors like Galen and Hippocrates, whose works were interpreted through the lens of medieval religious and philosophical beliefs. Illness was often thought to be caused by imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments aimed to restore balance through methods such as bloodletting, purging, or the use of herbal remedies. Physicians might recommend certain diets, changes in lifestyle, or prayers alongside physical treatments. Most people, however, had no access to trained physicians. Instead, they relied on local healers, herbalists, and midwives, whose knowledge was passed down through generations. These practitioners used plants like chamomile, sage, and garlic for their medicinal properties. They also drew upon folk traditions, including charms and rituals meant to protect against illness or speed recovery. Hospitals existed, but were very different from modern ones. Many were run by religious orders and served more as places of charity and refuge than centers of medical science. They cared for the sick, the poor, and travelers, offering food, shelter, and basic treatment. The focus was often on spiritual healing rather than curing the disease itself. Surgery was crude and risky, performed without anesthesia as we know it today. Pain was dulled with alcohol or opium-based mixtures, but the patient remained awake. Surgeons dealt with wounds, broken bones, and abscesses, often working in unsanitary conditions. Infection was common, and survival was never guaranteed. The Black Death of the 14th century revealed the limits of medieval medicine. This devastating plague swept across Europe, killing millions within a few years. Doctors, powerless to stop it, tried various remedies, from burning herbs to wearing beaked masks filled with aromatic substances. Many believed the disease was a punishment from God, leading to religious processions and acts of penance. Public health measures were rudimentary, but sometimes surprisingly effective. Quarantines were imposed in certain cities, and ships suspected of carrying disease were made to wait offshore for 40 days before docking, a practice from which the term quarantine originates. Still, without an understanding of germs, prevention was limited, and outbreaks could decimate entire communities. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. Midwives assisted, relying on experience and herbal remedies to ease labor. Complications were often fatal for both mother and child, and mortality rates were high. Baptism shortly after birth was common, both for religious reasons and because survival beyond infancy was uncertain. Despite the risks and the lack of modern knowledge, medieval medicine laid the groundwork for future discoveries. The preservation and translation of ancient texts in monasteries and Islamic medical centers allowed some ideas to endure. Slowly, through observation and experience, people began to question long-held beliefs, paving the way for the medical revolutions of later centuries. For the ordinary person, sickness was simply part of life's cycle, met with a combination of practical remedies, prayer, and acceptance. In a world where death was never far away, resilience and faith were as essential as any medicine. War was a constant presence in the medieval world, shaping politics, society, and even daily life. Conflicts between kingdoms, rival nobles, or invading forces could erupt at any time, often disrupting trade, agriculture, and the fragile sense of security in villages and towns. For many, the distant sound of marching soldiers or the sight of smoke on the horizon was a warning to flee or hide. Armies were composed of different groups: knights, men at arms, archers, and levied peasants. Knights were the elite warriors, bound by codes of chivalry and loyalty to their lords. They trained from a young age, learning to fight on horseback and master weapons such as swords, lances, and maces. Their armor, made of chainmail or later plate, offered significant protection, but was heavy and expensive. Only the wealthy could afford such equipment. Peasant soldiers, on the other hand, fought with whatever they had: spears, axes, or even farming tools adapted for battle. They received little training and were often called up in times of crisis. Archers, especially longbow men, in regions like England, could be decisive in battle, raining arrows from a distance before the enemy closed in. Siege warfare was common, as castles and fortified towns were difficult to capture by direct assault. Armies would surround a stronghold, cutting off supplies and waiting for hunger or disease to weaken the defenders. Siege engines like trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers were used to breach walls, while defenders poured boiling water, hurled stones, or fired arrows in return. Life during wartime was brutal for civilians. Crops could be trampled or stolen, livestock taken, and homes burned. Refugees crowded into towns or castles, straining resources and spreading disease. The chaos disrupted the agricultural cycle, leading to food shortages long after the fighting ended. Knights, despite their reputation for honor, were not always noble in conduct. Pillaging enemy lands, taking prisoners for ransom, and looting were common practices. War was as much about profit as it was about politics or ideology. Training for warfare was a lifelong pursuit for the nobility. Tournaments and jousts provided both entertainment and an opportunity to hone skills. These events drew crowds, with knights competing for glory, prizes, and the favor of ladies. However, accidents were frequent, and even these games could be deadly. Siege warfare was common, as castles and fortified towns were difficult to capture by direct assault. Armies would surround a stronghold, cutting off supplies and waiting for hunger or disease to weaken the defenders. Siege engines like trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers were used to breach walls, while defenders poured boiling water, hurled stones, or fired arrows in return. Life during wartime was brutal for civilians. Crops could be trampled or stolen, livestock taken, and homes burned. Refugees crowded into towns or castles, straining resources and spreading disease. The chaos disrupted the agricultural cycle, leading to food shortages long after the fighting ended. Knights, despite their reputation for honor, were not always noble in conduct. Pillaging enemy lands, taking prisoners for ransom, and looting were common practices. War was as much about profit as it was about politics or ideology. Training for warfare was a lifelong pursuit for the nobility. Tournaments and jousts provided both entertainment and an opportunity to hone skills. These events drew crowds, with knights competing for glory, prizes, and the favor of ladies. However, accidents were frequent, and even these games could be deadly. Naval warfare also played a role, particularly for coastal kingdoms. Ships transported troops, raided enemy shores, and intercepted merchant vessels. Naval battles often involved boarding enemy ships and fighting hand to hand, as cannons were not yet in common use during much of the medieval period. The end of a war did not necessarily bring peace. Treaties might be signed, but disputes could flare up again within months or years. Borders shifted, rulers changed, and alliances were fragile. For the common people, war was less a temporary event and more a recurring reality, another hardship to endure alongside famine, disease, and the demands of feudal life. Yet war also drove advancements in technology and strategy. The development of stronger fortifications, new weapons, and improved armor reflected the constant arms race of the medieval era. The introduction of gunpowder toward the later medieval period began to change the nature of warfare, signaling the eventual end of the dominance of the heavily armored knight. In the end, war in the medieval world was a force that shaped not only the political landscape, but also the very way people lived, worked, and fought. It was a backdrop to life, a reminder of the fragility of safety, and a constant test of resilience. Religion was at the heart of medieval life, influencing nearly every aspect of society, from politics to education, from art to daily routines. The vast majority of people in Europe during the Middle Ages were Christian, specifically Roman Catholic, and the Church was the most powerful institution of the era. It held not only spiritual authority, but also immense political and economic influence. From birth to death, religion marked the milestones of life. Baptism shortly after birth welcomed a child into the Christian community. Confirmation, marriage, and finally last rites were all conducted by clergy. Attendance at Sunday Mass was a weekly obligation, and religious festivals punctuated the year, providing moments of celebration, reflection, and rest from labor. The church owned vast amounts of land, collected tithes, a tenth of a person's income, and wielded the power to excommunicate those who disobeyed its laws. This power extended even to kings, who often sought the Pope's approval for major decisions. Conflicts between secular rulers and the Church were common, as both sought to assert authority over the same people and resources. Monasteries and convents were centers of learning, preservation, and charity. Monks and nuns lived according to strict rules, devoting their lives to prayer, study, and work. They copied manuscripts by hand, preserving ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost. Monasteries also provided hospitality to travelers and care for the sick. Pilgrimages were a significant part of religious devotion. People traveled great distances to visit holy sites, such as the shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, or the relics of saints in Canterbury. These journeys could be dangerous, but pilgrims believed they brought spiritual merit or divine favor. Religion shaped the medieval worldview, explaining natural events, human suffering, and the order of society. The idea of the great chain of being placed everything in a hierarchy, from God at the top, through angels, kings, nobles, and peasants, down to animals and plants. Questioning this order was rare, as it was seen as part of God's plan. The Church also used fear to maintain influence. The threat of eternal damnation and vivid depictions of hell in sermons and art kept people mindful of their sins. At the same time, the promise of heaven offered hope, particularly in a world where life was often harsh and short. Religious art and architecture flourished. Cathedrals with towering spires, intricate stained glass windows, and detailed sculptures were built to inspire awe and reflect the glory of God. These structures often took decades, even centuries, to complete, requiring the labor and resources of entire communities. However, the Church was not without corruption. Some clergy lived in luxury, ignored their vows, or sold indulgences, documents promising to reduce the punishment for sins. Such abuses would eventually lead to calls for reform, and centuries later, the Protestant Reformation. For the ordinary medieval person, faith was both a comfort and a guide. It provided answers in uncertain times, bound communities together, and gave meaning to suffering. Whether kneeling in a small village chapel or standing in the grand nave of a cathedral, the medieval believer lived in a world where the sacred and the everyday were deeply intertwined. The church also used fear to maintain influence. The threat of eternal damnation and vivid depictions of hell in sermons and art kept people mindful of their sins. At the same time, the promise of heaven offered hope, particularly in a world where life was often harsh and short. Religious art and architecture flourished. Cathedrals with towering spires, intricate stained glass windows, and detailed sculptures were built to inspire awe and reflect the glory of God. These structures often took decades, even centuries, to complete, requiring the labor and resources of entire communities. However, the church was not without corruption. Some clergy lived in luxury, ignored their vows, or sold indulgences, documents promising to reduce the punishment for sins. Such abuses would eventually lead to calls for reform, and centuries later, the Protestant Reformation. For the ordinary medieval person, faith was both a comfort and a guide. It provided answers in uncertain times, bound communities together, and gave meaning to suffering. Whether kneeling in a small village chapel or standing in the grand nave of a cathedral, the medieval believer lived in a world where the sacred and the everyday were deeply intertwined. The relationships in feudal society were based on mutual obligation. A lord owed his vassals protection and justice, while vassals owed their lord loyalty and service. Breaking these bonds was considered both dishonorable and dangerous, as trust was the foundation of the entire system. Manors were the basic economic units of the feudal world. A manor included the lord's estate, peasant villages, farmland, and sometimes a church. The lord's manor house or castle served as the administrative center, where disputes were settled, taxes collected, and resources managed. Daily life in the feudal system was shaped by the seasons. Planting, harvesting, and tending animals filled most of the year for peasants, while nobles focused on managing their estates, training for warfare, and attending to political matters. Festivals and holy days provided rare breaks from the routine, bringing moments of music, feasting, and games. The rigidity of the feudal system meant that social mobility was extremely rare. Most people were born into their station and remained there for life. However, exceptional skill in battle, the favor of a powerful patron, or the wealth gained from trade could sometimes elevate an individual's status. Feudalism also fostered a culture of loyalty and honor, especially among the nobility. The idea of chivalry, a code of conduct emphasizing bravery, courtesy, and respect for women and the weak, shaped the ideals of knighthood, though in practice it was not always followed. While the feudal system brought stability to a fractured world, it also reinforced inequality. The majority labored to support the privileged few, and the protection offered by lords came at the cost of personal freedom. Over time, changes in warfare, trade, and politics would challenge this structure, paving the way for the decline of feudalism and the rise of new social orders. Life in medieval towns offered a sharp contrast to the rural existence of the feudal countryside. Towns were centers of trade, craftsmanship, and commerce, bustling with activity and filled with people from all walks of life. Many medieval towns grew up around strategic locations, river crossings, crossroads, or near castles and monasteries. Their location made them ideal for trade, drawing merchants and craftsmen from surrounding areas. High stone walls often encircled the town for protection, with gates that closed at night to keep out thieves and invaders. The streets were narrow and winding, often muddy or littered with waste. Houses were built close together, with upper stories sometimes jutting out over the street. Shops and workshops occupied the ground floors, while families lived above. The air was filled with the smells of cooking fires, livestock, and the goods being produced, from leather and cloth to bread and beer. Markets were the bloodline of medieval towns. Merchants sold goods ranging from locally grown produce to exotic spices, silks, and other luxuries brought from distant lands. Weekly markets drew people from surrounding villages, while annual fairs attracted traders from far-off regions. These fairs were not only commercial events, but also occasions for entertainment, with jugglers, musicians, and games. Craftsmen organized themselves into guilds, associations that regulated the quality of goods, set prices, and trained apprentices. Becoming a master craftsman required years of learning and producing a masterpiece to prove one's skill. Guilds were powerful organizations that could influence local politics and ensure the prosperity of their members. Towns also had their own forms of government, often led by councils of wealthy merchants or influential citizens. Some towns gained charters granting them special rights, such as the ability to hold markets or govern themselves independently from local lords. This relative independence allowed urban communities to thrive and innovate. However, town life came with its own challenges. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the lack of clean water made disease a constant threat. Fires could spread rapidly through the densely packed wooden buildings, and crime was a concern despite the presence of watchmen. Despite these dangers, towns offered opportunities unavailable in the countryside. Skilled workers could earn a good living, merchants could amass wealth, and ambitious individuals could climb the social ladder through trade and business. The diversity of people and ideas in towns also made them centers of cultural exchange and progress. Towns played a vital role in the gradual transformation of medieval society. As trade expanded and urban populations grew, the power of merchants and craftsmen began to rival that of the nobility. The rise of a wealthy middle class would eventually contribute to the weakening of the feudal order and the shaping of the modern world. Religion was the cornerstone of life in medieval Europe, shaping beliefs, laws, and daily routines. The Catholic Church stood at the center of this spiritual and social order, exerting influence over kings, nobles, and commoners alike. Every town and village revolved around its church. The local parish church was not only a place of worship, but also a gathering space for the community. It hosted baptisms, marriages, funerals, and festivals tied to the liturgical calendar. For many, the rhythms of life were measured by church bells, marking the hours of prayer and calling the faithful to Mass. At the top of the church's hierarchy was the Pope, followed by cardinals, bishops, and priests. Monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and service lived in monasteries and convents. These religious communities preserved knowledge, copied manuscripts, and provided education, healthcare, and charity to the poor. Faith permeated all aspects of medieval life. People believed that their actions on earth would determine their fate in the afterlife. Heaven, hell, and purgatory were vivid realities in the minds of the faithful, and the Church's teachings guided moral behavior. Pilgrimages were a popular expression of devotion. Pilgrims traveled long distances to visit holy sites, such as the shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, or the relics of saints housed in grand cathedrals. These journeys were both spiritual and social events, offering travelers a chance to see new places and meet fellow believers. The construction of cathedrals was one of the most impressive achievements of the medieval church. Built over decades or even centuries, these massive stone structures reached toward the heavens, symbolizing the glory of God. Gothic cathedrals, with their pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and stained glass windows, filled worshippers with awe. However, the church was not without its critics. Corruption, the sale of indulgences, and the political involvement of clergy led some to question its authority. Movements for reform would emerge over time, challenging the unity of Christendom. Despite its flaws, the Church provided a sense of order and purpose in a world often marked by hardship. It offered hope in times of famine, war, and disease, reminding people that earthly suffering was temporary compared to the promise of eternal life. Religion also shaped art, music, and education. Illuminated manuscripts, religious paintings, and sacred music were created to glorify God and teach the faithful. Universities, many founded by the Church, became centers of learning that preserved classical knowledge and advanced philosophy, theology, and science. In the medieval mindset, the sacred and the secular were intertwined. Every oath, treaty, and coronation was blessed by the Church, reinforcing its authority over both spiritual and temporal matters. The medieval diet was shaped by the seasons, social class, and local availability of food. For peasants, meals were simple and repetitive, often consisting of bread, pottage, a thick vegetable stew, and whatever vegetables or legumes were in season. Meat was rare for the lower classes, typically eaten only during special occasions or festivals. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet. The type and quality of bread varied depending on wealth. Nobles enjoyed fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour, while peasants often ate coarse dark bread made from rye, barley, or oats. Baking was usually done in communal ovens, as few households had their own. Pottage was another staple, simmered over an open fire and flavored with herbs. Ingredients varied, but could include cabbage, onions, leeks, beans, and peas. In times of scarcity, pottage might be thin and plain. In better times, it could be enriched with meat or fish. For those who could afford it, meat and fish were central to the diet. Nobles feasted on venison, pork, beef, and poultry, often seasoned with imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. Freshwater and saltwater fish were widely consumed, especially on days when the Church forbade eating meat. Common fish included herring, cod and eel. Dairy products were common among peasants, with cheese and butter providing valuable calories and protein. Milk was often turned into cheese to preserve it, especially in rural areas. Eggs were also an important source of nutrition, though hens were usually kept for laying rather than for meat. Fruits and nuts were seasonal treats. Apples, pears, cherries, and plums were eaten fresh or dried for winter. Wealthier households enjoyed imported delights like figs, dates, and almonds, which were expensive and highly prized. Drinks varied by class as well. Ale and beer were the most common beverages for peasants, as water was often unsafe to drink. Nobles and wealthy merchants enjoyed wine, particularly in regions where it could be locally produced or imported. Honey was used to sweeten drinks and food, as refined sugar was a rare luxury. Feasts were an important part of medieval culture, especially for the upper classes. Banquets could last for hours, with multiple courses of elaborate dishes served in sequence. Entertainment during feasts might include music, poetry, or even jousting tournaments. Table manners varied, but eating with one's hands was common, especially among the lower classes. Knives were shared, and spoons were used for soups and stews. Forks were rare until the late Middle Ages, and trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, often served as plates, soaking up the juices from the meal. Food preservation was essential, as refrigeration did not exist. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were common methods to store meat and fish. Root cellars kept vegetables cool, while grains were stored in granaries to last through the winter. In all, medieval food reflected the rhythms of agricultural life, the influence of religion, and the stark contrasts between rich and poor. While peasants endured a monotonous diet, the nobility used their wealth to turn meals into displays of status and power. Medicine in the medieval period was a complex mix of ancient theories, superstitions, and practical remedies. Much of it was based on the writings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, especially Galen and Hippocrates, whose works were preserved and studied by scholars in Europe and the Islamic world. One of the central concepts in medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this belief, a person's health depended on keeping these humors in balance. Illness was thought to result from an excess or deficiency of one humor, and treatments aimed to restore balance. Common treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the use of herbal medicines. Bloodletting was performed using leeches or by making small cuts in the skin to let blood flow out. Purging involved inducing vomiting or using laxatives to cleanse the body. Herbal medicines were made from plants like sage, rosemary, and chamomile, which were believed to have healing properties. Monasteries played a key role in medieval health care. Monks grew medicinal herbs in their gardens, copied medical texts, and provided care for the sick. Many monasteries had an infirmary where basic treatments were administered. Hospitals also existed, though they were often more focused on providing spiritual comfort than curing illness. Surgery was a risky and painful affair. Without anesthesia, patients were awake during procedures, enduring immense pain. Surgeons, often trained as barbers, performed tasks such as setting broken bones, treating wounds, and removing abscesses. Infection was common, as the importance of cleanliness was not well understood. Superstition and religion were deeply intertwined with medicine. Many believed that illness could be caused by sin, curses, or the alignment of the stars. Astrology was sometimes consulted to determine the best time for treatment. Amulets, charms, and prayers were used alongside herbal remedies, reflecting the blending of spiritual and physical healing. The Black Death of the 14th century highlighted both the strengths and limitations of medieval medicine. Physicians struggled to understand the cause of the plague, proposing theories ranging from miasma, bad air, to divine punishment. Treatments varied wildly, from lancing buboes to carrying fragrant herbs in an attempt to ward off the disease. Despite the lack of effective cures, the crisis spurred some improvements in public health, such as quarantines and better urban sanitation. Knowledge also flowed between cultures. The Islamic world, with its advanced medical scholarship, contributed significantly to European medicine. Translations of Arabic medical texts introduced new techniques, drugs, and ideas, including the importance of cleanliness and observation. By the late Middle Ages, universities began to formalize medical education. Physicians studied Latin texts and learned through lectures, though hands-on experience was limited. This academic approach, combined with traditional practices, laid the groundwork for the medical advances of the Renaissance. In short, medieval medicine was a blend of science, faith, and tradition. While many treatments were ineffective by modern standards, They reflected a genuine desire to understand and combat illness in a world where disease was ever present. Medieval towns and cities were bustling hubs of trade, craft, and social life, though they were often cramped, noisy, and unsanitary. The streets were typically narrow and winding, lined with timber-framed houses that sometimes leaned precariously toward one another. Markets were the lifeblood of urban life. Merchants and traders set up stalls selling everything from fresh produce and bread to cloth, tools, and imported spices. Market days drew people from the surrounding countryside, turning the town square into a lively and crowded meeting place. Craftsmen organized themselves into guilds, associations that regulated training, quality, and prices within a trade. There were guilds for blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, carpenters, and many other professions. Apprentices trained for years under a master craftsman before becoming journeymen and eventually masters themselves. Guilds also provided social support and protection for their members. The town was often divided into districts based on occupation or social status. Wealthy merchants and officials lived in larger, better-built houses, often with glass windows, a luxury in the Middle Ages. Poorer residents lived in smaller, more crowded dwellings. Overcrowding was common, and sanitation was minimal. Waste disposal was a constant problem. People often dumped household waste, including chamber pot contents, directly into the streets or nearby rivers. This contributed to the spread of disease, especially in warmer months. Rats and other vermin were common, and the smell of urban life could be overwhelming. Despite these challenges, towns offered opportunities unavailable in rural areas. A successful craftsman or merchant could rise in wealth and status. Town charters granted certain rights and privileges, including the ability to hold markets and fairs, which were important economic events. Entertainment in towns came in many forms. Minstrels performed songs and stories in taverns. Actors staged plays in public squares, and festivals celebrated religious or civic occasions. Churches and cathedrals dominated the urban skyline, often serving as the focal point of the town. These buildings were not only places of worship, but also centers of community life, hosting markets, meetings, and processions. The construction of a grand cathedral could take decades or even centuries, employing generations of craftsmen and laborers. Law and order were maintained by town officials and watchmen, though crime was an ongoing concern. Thieves, pickpockets, and even organized gangs operated in the crowded streets. Punishments could be severe, including fines, public humiliation, or imprisonment in dark, damp cells. Trade connected towns to a wider world. Ports and river towns shipped goods across Europe and beyond. Imported items like fine cloth, wine, and exotic spices were highly valued and often displayed as symbols of wealth. While medieval towns lacked many comforts of modern cities, they were vibrant centers of human activity, brimming with ambition, creativity, and resilience. For many, they represented opportunity and freedom, a sharp contrast to the rigid life of the countryside. Medieval travel was slow, challenging, and often dangerous. For most people, journeys were short, as life revolved around the village, town, or manor where they were born. However, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and messengers often traveled great distances, crossing mountains, forests, and seas to reach their destinations. The most common way to travel was on foot. Ordinary villagers might walk miles to a market, carrying goods in baskets or on carts. Wealthier travelers used horses or mules, which made the journey faster but still far from comfortable. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks, becoming muddy in rain and dusty in summer. Bridges were rare, so travelers sometimes had to ford rivers or use ferries. Pilgrimages were a major reason for long-distance travel. Devout Christians journeyed to holy sites like Canterbury in England, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or Rome in Italy. Pilgrims traveled in groups for safety, carrying badges or tokens from the shrines they visited. Along the way, they stayed at inns, monasteries, or hospices, which provided food, shelter, and sometimes medical care. Merchants traveled between towns and across borders, bringing goods such as wool, wine, spices, and metals. Trade routes connected Europe to Asia through the Silk Road, and maritime routes linked ports across the Mediterranean and the North Sea. Merchant caravans were often well armed to protect against bandits, and sea voyages had to contend with storms and pirates. Knights and soldiers traveled for war, tournaments, or to serve their lords. Military campaigns could last months or years, and armies often moved slowly due to the need to carry supplies, weapons, and siege equipment. Traveling with an army was dangerous. Disease, hunger, and poor weather claimed many lives before battle even began. For communication, messengers carried letters between rulers, nobles, and merchants. These couriers had to be quick and discreet, often riding for days without rest. Official messages might be sealed with wax to prove their authenticity. Accommodation for travelers ranged from simple inns to the hospitality of monasteries. Inns were usually crowded and noisy, with guests sharing beds and sleeping in their clothes to keep warm. Food was basic: bread, cheese, stew, and ale. Wealthier travelers could afford private rooms, while the poor often slept in stables or under the open sky. Travel hazards were numerous. Bandits lurked along remote roads, preying on the unwary. Wild animals, especially wolves and boars, posed a threat in rural areas. Weather could halt a journey entirely, and sickness was a constant risk. Political unrest could make certain regions unsafe, as wars and feuds disrupted trade routes and travel corridors. Despite these dangers, travel was an important part of medieval life. It spread ideas, connected markets, and brought people into contact with new cultures. Pilgrims shared stories of far-away lands. Merchants introduced exotic goods, and soldiers returned with tales of foreign campaigns. For the few who could afford it, travel was also a means of education and adventure. Nobles sometimes sent their sons abroad to serve as squires in other courts, learning skills, languages, and customs. Scholars traveled to study at famous universities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Medieval travel may have been slow and perilous, but it shaped the cultural and economic landscape of the period, linking distant regions and enriching the lives of those willing to face its hardships. Medieval food was shaped by geography, climate, and social status. While nobles enjoyed a wide variety of dishes, the diet of peasants was far simpler, relying heavily on grains and seasonal vegetables. For the majority of the population, bread was the staple food. It came in many forms, from coarse rye loaves for the poor to fine white wheat bread for the wealthy. Bread was not only eaten on its own, but also used as a base for meals, serving as a plate or trencher that soaked up juices and sauces. Porridge and pottage were common daily meals. These could be enriched with bits of meat or fish when available, but often remained vegetarian out of necessity. The growing seasons determined what vegetables were eaten, with cabbages, leeks, onions, and turnips being common. Meat was a luxury for most peasants, consumed mainly on special occasions. Common meats included pork, beef, mutton, and poultry. Hunting was reserved for the nobility, so game like deer or wild boar was rarely available to ordinary people. Nobles, however, dined on an array of meats, including swan, peacock, and venison, often prepared with elaborate spices and sauces. Fish was an important part of the diet, especially because church rules required fasting from meat on certain days. In coastal areas, fresh fish like herring and cod were eaten, while inland communities relied on preserved fish, salted, smoked, or pickled, which could be stored for months. Dairy products such as cheese, butter, and milk were consumed daily, though fresh milk was less common for adults. Cheese was a convenient way to preserve milk and came in many varieties, from soft and fresh to aged and hard. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were highly valued and expensive, imported from distant lands. The wealthy used them not only to flavor food, but also to display their status. Herbs such as parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme were grown in kitchen gardens and used in everyday cooking. Sweet dishes were rare for commoners, but enjoyed at noble feasts. These included honey cakes, spiced wine, and fruit tarts. Sugar was an expensive luxury, and honey was the primary sweetener. Fruits such as apples, pears, plums, and berries were eaten fresh in season or preserved for winter. Meals were typically eaten twice a day, a midday dinner and an evening supper. Breakfast was rare for adults, but sometimes given to children, the sick, or laborers before starting work. At the table, diners often ate from shared dishes, using knives and spoons, but rarely forks, which were not yet common in much of Europe. Feasts were an important part of medieval culture, especially among the nobility. They marked weddings, victories, religious holidays, and visits from important guests. A noble feast might last for hours, featuring dozens of courses, music, dancing, and elaborate entertainment like jesters or acrobats. Ale and beer were the most common drinks for all classes, as water was often unsafe. Nobles preferred wine when it was available, importing it from regions like France or Italy. Cider and mead were also enjoyed in certain areas. Food not only sustained life, but also reflected the social order. What you ate and how it was prepared was a clear sign of your wealth, status, and connections. For the medieval person, meals were both a necessity and a way to participate in the traditions and customs of their community. Medieval clothing varied greatly depending on a person's social status, occupation, and the period within the Middle Ages. While the basic purpose was to protect against the elements, clothing also served as a marker of wealth, identity, and even morality. For peasants, clothing was practical and durable. Men typically wore a simple tunic made from wool or linen, belted at the waist, with hose or leggings. In colder weather, they layered cloaks or mantles for warmth. Women wore long dresses with fitted bodices and wide skirts, often layered with aprons and head coverings. These garments were usually made at home or locally, using coarse, undyed fabrics in natural shades of brown, gray, and green. The nobility, in contrast, wore richly colored and finely tailored garments. Bright dyes like deep reds, royal blues, and vibrant purples signified wealth, as they were expensive to produce. Fabrics such as silk, velvet, and fine linen were imported from distant lands, making them luxury items. Noble men often wore long flowing robes or surcoats lined with fur, while women donned elaborate gowns with fitted sleeves, trailing trains, and intricate embroidery. Headwear was important for both men and women. Men might wear hoods, hats, or coifs, while noble women often adorned their heads with veils, wimples, or elaborate headdresses like the hennin, a tall conical hat sometimes draped with gauze. Married women, regardless of status, were generally expected to cover their hair in public. Shoes were usually made of leather, but styles varied. Peasants wore sturdy, practical footwear, while the wealthy favored pointed shoes, known as poulaines, which could have extremely long toes. These fashionable shoes, however, were often impractical for walking long distances. Sumptuary laws in many medieval societies regulated what people could wear based on their social rank. These laws were designed to reinforce class distinctions and prevent the lower classes from imitating the appearance of the nobility. For example, only certain ranks could wear fur or specific colors like purple. Clothing also changed with the seasons. In winter, cloaks lined with fur or sheepskin provided warmth, while in summer, lighter fabrics and looser garments were worn. Layers were common, as they allowed for flexibility in changing weather. Accessories played an important role in fashion. Belts were not only functional, but often decorative, featuring metal buckles or embroidery. Jewelry such as rings, brooches, and necklaces displayed wealth and status, though most peasants owned little to no adornment. Pouches or purses were worn on belts to carry coins or small personal items, as pockets were not yet common. Occupational clothing reflected the work being done. Blacksmiths, bakers, and other tradesmen wore aprons for protection, while monks and nuns wore simple religious habits. Soldiers and knights had specific attire for battle, including padded gambesons, chainmail, and eventually plate armor, often worn over a surcoat, displaying their coat of arms. Children's clothing was similar to that of adults, though simpler in design. Babies were swaddled in linen, and young children wore tunics or dresses until they were old enough for more fitted garments. Despite the differences between social classes, medieval clothing shared a common emphasis on functionality, symbolism, and tradition. Every stitch, fabric, and colored choice could speak volumes about a person's role in society, their wealth, and their connection to the world around them. The medieval castle was more than just a fortress. It was the center of political power, social life, and economic activity. Rising above the surrounding landscape, castles symbolized authority and control, offering protection in times of war and serving as a home in times of peace. Most castles began as wooden fortifications, known as motte and bailey structures, with a wooden keep built on a raised mound, the motte, and an enclosed courtyard below. Over time, stone replaced wood, making castles more durable and resistant to fire and siege. The outer defenses often included high curtain walls, guard towers, and a deep moat filled with water or left dry as a trench. Access was controlled by a drawbridge and a fortified gatehouse, sometimes equipped with a portcullis, a heavy iron grill that could be dropped quickly to block entry. Inside, the layout of a castle varied, but certain rooms were common. The Great Hall served as the heart of the castle, where the lord held feasts, administered justice, and met with guests. Chambers provided private living space for the lord and his family, while the kitchen, pantry, and buttery supported the daily preparation of meals. Castles also contained chapels for worship, storerooms for supplies, and stables for horses. Servants and soldiers lived within the walls, often in more modest quarters. In larger castles, entire communities of craftsmen, guards, and laborers worked together to keep life running smoothly. Life in a castle was busy, but not always comfortable. While the stone walls provided safety, they also made interiors cold and damp. Heating came from large fireplaces, but only the main rooms were kept warm. Light was provided by candles and oil lamps, though windows were small and often covered with oiled cloth or shutters rather than glass. Castles were designed for defense, and their features reflected that purpose. Narrow arrow slits allowed defenders to fire arrows while remaining protected. Machicolations, openings in the floor of battlements, allowed objects or boiling liquids to be dropped on attackers below. In times of siege, castles relied on stored food, wells for water, and the ability to withstand long isolation. However, castles were not only military structures, they were also symbols of prestige. Nobles invested in decorative stonework, colorful banners, and comfortable furnishings to display their wealth and power. The surrounding grounds often included gardens, orchards, and even hunting parks. Tournaments and feasts brought excitement to castle life. Knights competed in jousts and melee combat, while musicians, storytellers, and jesters entertained the gathered crowds. These events reinforced loyalty among subjects and displayed the strength of the ruling lord. Over the centuries, castles evolved. By the late Middle Ages, advances in siege weapons, such as trebuchets and cannons, began to challenge their defensive value. Many castles were transformed into more comfortable palaces, focusing on luxury rather than fortification. Today, the remains of Middle Ages castles still dot the landscapes of Europe, standing as silent witnesses to an age of knights, lords, and the struggles for power. Though their walls may be crumbling, their history endures, each stone telling the story of battles fought, alliances forged, and lives lived within their shadow. By the closing years of the Middle Ages, Europe was a land transformed. The centuries of feudal loyalty, castle walls, and church bells had shaped every aspect of daily life. But change was in the air, slowly unfolding like the turning of the seasons. The rhythm of medieval existence was slow, deliberate, and deeply tied to nature. Days began at sunrise, with roosters crowing in village yards, and the toll of bells calling monks and townsfolk alike to prayer or work. In the countryside, peasants tended to their fields with the same tools and methods their grandparents had used, plowing with oxen, sowing by hand, and harvesting with sickles. In the towns, merchants opened their shops, craftsmen hammered at their workbenches, and apprentices carried buckets of water from the well. Seasons dictated the pace of life. Winter was a time of endurance, when warmth and food were precious and days were short. Spring brought planting and hope. Summer meant long hours in the fields, and autumn was a season of harvest, when granaries were filled and celebrations marked the turning of the year. Faith was the anchor of medieval society. Church bells punctuated the day, calling people to worship or reminding them of the passing hours. Cathedrals rose above towns like stone forests, their spires reaching toward the heavens. Inside, flickering candlelight illuminated carved altars. Stained glass windows told stories in vivid color, and the solemn chants of monks echoed through the air. Religion guided not only spiritual life, but also laws, festivals, and the calendar itself.